Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2024 NAMI New Hampshire Annual Conference, Cultivating Hope, Celebrating Everyday Heroes. Thank you for joining us. If you're new to NAMI New Hampshire, we are so glad you are here. If you're a longtime member of the NAMI New Hampshire family, thank you for coming back. NAMI New Hampshire is a grassroots organization that provides support, education, and advocacy to individuals and their families impacted by mental illness and suicide in the Granite State. We do this by offering a variety of programs and events, including today's conference. I'm Karen Prive. I'm one of your co-hosts today, along with Michelle Watson. Today's presentations are in Zoom webinar. There will not be an option to turn on your camera or microphone. We welcome questions in the Q&A and we'll do our best to get to them all. You may have also noticed that we have turned off the chat feature, which sometimes can be distracting. We'd like to express our thanks. Hold on one moment. We'd like to express our thanks to our sponsors who help make today's conference available free of charge. Thank you, WellSense Health Plan, for sponsoring this session and for your continued support of NAMI New Hampshire. I'd now like to introduce Lisa Morgan of Lisa Morgan Consulting, who will present crisis support and suicide prevention for autistic people. Lisa has a connection to NAMI New Hampshire. She trained as an in her own voice speaker. I heard her on a webinar presenting this information earlier this year, and am really glad to welcome her back. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. So welcome, everyone. We are going to talk about crisis supports and suicide prevention for autistic people. And I like to just remind everybody that we will be talking about suicide and possibly self-harm, and to take a break if you need one. If you feel triggered at all, take care of yourself. 988 is the national call, text, or chat line, and if you need even more support or assistance. And I also want to make a note about language. As an autistic adult, I use identity first language in my presentations, and will in this presentation. And that's aligned with my own preferences and those of my autistic colleagues and friends. But I also recognize that not all people use or prefer this identity first language. And so, to be respectful, each person should be given the opportunity to choose the language they prefer to be identified by. We're going to be describing the most researched and supported unique risk factors of suicide for autistic people, explain how to communicate and support autistic people in crisis, and then to apply some autistic specific resources to support autistic people in crisis. So first question is, why do we need crisis supports and suicide prevention for autistic people? Well, first of all, it is a leading cause of death for autistic people, and research for not really a long time, because I got into this advocacy work around 2016, and there was no research for those autistic people with an intellectual disability. They were saying that, it was that suicide was a cause of death for autistic people without an intellectual disability. But now we do have research. You'll see later on in my presentation that autistic people with an intellectual disability have just as high of a risk. Also, autistic people are not believed. Some reasons are due to masking, which I'll talk about later as well. Flat affect. I support autistic people in crisis, and I've been told many times that they've gone to ERs with, telling people that they are suicidal, and they're sent home because they don't have any outward distress or outward, kind of facial expressions or anything like that, that they get sent home with no support. And communication differences and trying to explain what's going on for them as well. There are unique risk factors of suicide, and as well, all the risk factors for the general population pertain to autistic people. Warning signs don't meet the needs of autistic people. One of the resources that I'm going to share is considerations to take when using the warning signs of suicide for the general population, because some of them are aspects of autism. Suicide assessments are not made for autistic people, who tend to be very literal thinkers and literal way of, answering the questions on the assessments, and they may fall through the cracks. Interventions don't make space for autistic culture. So a lot of professionals as well look at autistic people through the medical model, mostly through the DSM-5. And it's really deficit-based with disability, dysfunction, disorder. And it is in many ways a disability for many people, but looking at it only through the medical model really looks at what's wrong instead of what a person might need. So some of the things in the DSM-5 are compromised communication skills, cognitive rigidity, degrees of impaired social ability and making small talk and attention to detail, limited repetitive behaviors, stimming and rocking, which are needed in crisis for regulation, narrow focused interests or special passions, which actually can be used in crisis to get somebody out of a perseverative negative thought pattern. Sensory processing issues like the environment and even internally with an over active central nervous system. So these are all true, but they can also cause what I call unintentional harm, because many professionals don't understand the need to assess an autistic person for support. I've trained in a really pretty big research study. I was a co-lead on the clinician training team, and we trained over 250 clinicians, and many of them said if they find out somebody is autistic, they don't even assess them for suicide. So it's not known that autistic people have a high risk of suicide. Many first responders don't understand ways to work with an autistic person in crisis, which is why I got into this advocacy work, because the night we found my husband had died by suicide, the first responders were supportive and everything, but not the support that I understood as support. The behavior of autistic people is many times misunderstood and can be reacted to in a negative way, causing unintentional harm. And then autistic people just tend to not get their needs met. So what does unintentional harm look like? It's friendly, it's encouraging, it's empathetic and caring to non-autistic people, and some to autistic people as well, because everyone's different on the autism spectrum. So some may work, but for a lot of people, so for instance, the night I found my husband, one of the policemen kind of standing behind me put his hand on my shoulder. It was a heavy hand, and it scared me, and I didn't know how to react. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. For months afterwards, when I thought about that night, I could feel that hand on my shoulder. It took me a long time to realize that it was actually an encouraging act, to put a hand on shoulder, but not to me, not to my senses, not to my, processing speed, the high anxiety I had. It just was not encouraging or supportive. So unintentional harm by well-meaning professionals is still harm. So looking at, and we talked about the medical model, now looking at autism through a social model is really much more supportive for an autistic person, understanding that autism is a spectrum condition and that the spectrum is not linear, going from like a low functioning to a high functioning kind of thing. It's more circular. And if you see with this pie right here, and there's aspects of autism listed, and at times the pie might look like this, and in the afternoon, it could look completely different. Because skills and abilities kind of come and go, and are, autistic people can do something in the morning that they might not be able to do in the afternoon, depending on what has happened between morning and afternoon, and how much they're able to regulate. And so knowing that is helpful as well. Knowing about sensory issues in the environment, as well as an overactive central nervous system, and knowing the autism culture, which some of the autism culture would be that, autistic people think differently, could be very literal, could have a visual memory and think in pictures, really have a focus on details, know that there's focused passions, and stimming. Sometimes, I stim when I twirl my hair, which is socially acceptable, but stimming is used to regulate. And so understanding that and supporting someone in a crisis and giving them even permission to go ahead and stim if they need to is supportive. Using honest, literal speech. And we talk about that in one of the resources. And then knowing that, with self-care, a lot of people withdraw for self-care. So we use the social model in our resources to support autistic people. But autism and suicide, what do we know about autism and suicide? We know that autistic individuals are significantly more likely to think about, attempt, and die by suicide than the general population. We know suicide is a leading cause of premature death in autistic people. We don't know much about the protective factors for autistic people. What we do know is the protective factors for the general population are not protective factors for autistic people. In fact, some of them are unique risk factors. And autistic people have unique risk factors. As well, autistic adults are 9 times more likely to think about, attempt, or die by suicide than the general population. With a study done by Cassidy et al., 60% of the newly diagnosed autistic adults in that study reported suicidal ideation, compared to just 17% in the general population in that study. Same study, 35% had planned or attempted suicide, compared to 2.5% in the general population. And for children, it's pretty much the same, if not worse. Autistic children are 28 times more likely to think about or attempt suicide. And suicidal ideation and behavior has been reported in autistic children even under 10 years old. So it goes across the lifespan. And then we do have this new research where autistic adults with an intellectual disability are more likely to attempt to die by suicide. They have a lower occurrence of suicidal ideation than autistic people without an intellectual disability. There's more difficulty with communication. There's poorer access to services. And we really need improved understanding of anxiety and depression in this population. But I'm glad that they are starting to look at that population through research. I'm going to talk about anxiety. And as you'll see as we go along in these next few slides, how it sort of plays in autistic people being suicidal, making attempts, and dying by suicide. So it's among the most common comorbidities of autism spectrum disorder. Research does vary on the numbers of autistic people who suffer from anxiety, but consensus says that 40 to 50% of autistic people have a clinical diagnosis of anxiety. And it could be generalized anxiety, it could be social phobia, it could be agoraphobia. There's many different types of anxiety. It could be even more than one together. And then there's a population study in Denmark. It was a 20-year study, 6.5 million people in it. And out of the autistic people in it, the study found 90% of them had a co-occurring disorder, with one of the most common being anxiety and the next being depression. So there's many reasons why, there's many reasons why an autistic person might have chronic anxiety. The environment can cause anxiety because of the sensory challenges. Invalidation, when an autistic person might tell someone that the lights are too loud, and the other person can't hear them, or there's too much noise and they're the only ones who feel that way, or the temperature is too hot or too cold. One example I can share from my own life experience is I used to work, before I got into advocacy work, I was a teacher, and the last place I worked was a small private school, 6 staff. There were about 30 students, about 80% of them on the autism spectrum somewhere. And I came in on a Monday morning and I could smell something. Something was different. I couldn't place it, but I could smell it. And nobody else could smell it. Not any of the kids, not any of the staff. On Tuesday, when I went in, I could smell it stronger, still couldn't place it. Still no one could smell it. And I started feeling, is it me? Nobody believed me. So finally on the 3rd day, the school leader could smell it in the same way I could on Monday, like a little bit of something, couldn't place it. By this time, it's overpowering me, my sinus is burning. So because I had one more person, that validation, I went in to look for it. And we had a second stairs that we never used. And I went up there, and halfway up the stairs, I knew exactly what it was. Over the weekend, someone had power washed the roof. And there's a door out there leading to the roof, and someone put the big gas powered power washer inside the door and closed the door, and it was gas fumes. And so we were able at that point to get all the kids out of the school and air the school out and be safe. But that kind of sensory in the environment, I was very anxious about what was going on those days because nobody else could had the same experience I did. Social situations can cause anxiety. There's so much autistic people don't understand about social situations. Same school, when I first started, one of the teachers said, "I'll text you later, Lisa," as she was leaving. And I thought, I'm going to make a friend. This is great. No text came. And I thought, she's probably busy, maybe forgot. She kept doing that day after day. And I thought, I don't know what's going on. But I was pretty anxious about it because I don't know if I was missing the text, what I was supposed to do. It was just confusing. Well, when I asked her, she said it was her way of saying goodbye, see you later kind of thing. And for me, goodbye is goodbye. Text you later means she'll text me later. So, social situations can be confusing. Change can be very difficult. It can put an autistic person into crisis. Autistic people count on sameness. So they plan their days to know what to expect to the tiniest detail, where they're going, how they're going to get there. Can they leave early? Who's going with them? Who will they see there? Will they have to make small talk? Will there be loud music? I mean, on and on, what will be expected of them? And then when something changes, all that planning is gone and they're left with no plans to depend on. That's very highly anxiety producing, to have to wing it at that point. And then masking, autistic people use the social strategy of masking their autism to fit in, which is exhausting. And research has shown it's detrimental to their mental health because no one knows them for who they truly are as people. It's profoundly lonely, even though it's a social strategy that works to have that relationship, to have that job, to go to a higher education and get, a degree. It's profoundly lonely because the whole time they're acting like they're not themselves. They're also suppressing all aspects of their autism, any sensory sensitivities in the environment. They're not regulating, and they do their best to look and act like everyone else around them. But the mask is not the same as when people act different in different circumstances, like between school and home or home and work. There's some masking there too, or going to McDonald's or a fancy restaurant. You're kind of masking at a fancy restaurant. Masking for autistic people is changing who they are as a person all day long, every day, every week, every month, for years and years and years. I know I most likely started in first grade when I didn't know how to make a friend and I didn't know how to start being involved, like join the game. I didn't know any of that. And so I didn't, and I was alone a lot, and I would watch the other kids and start doing what they did and saying what they said. And I learned, that's when I started to mask and just continue doing that my whole life. So a lot of autistic people don't even develop a sense of self because they're always trying to act like the other people who they think know what to do. Relationships can be anxiety producing. I've experienced the ending of many friendships and have no idea why, so I can't learn. And that's the same story for many, many autistic adults. And there's so much about employment that can cause anxiety for autistic adults. First, just the interview process is heavily based on first impressions, thinking fast, making decisions, performing on the spot, none of which are easy for autistic people. We can have a slow processing speed unrelated to intelligence. Let's see, where was I? So we're on alexithymia. I think I personally recognized the motion of anger when I was somewhere in my 30s. And so asking, as far as crisis supports, asking a person with alexithymia how they're feeling is really difficult to answer. Asking them what they're thinking about is a much more supportive way of asking in a crisis. But alexithymia does not stop someone from experiencing negative emotions. They just don't know what they are. Typically, I will say, I don't feel well inside because I know I'm experiencing some kind of negative emotion, but I don't know what it is. And I also might cry, but not know what I'm crying about. So there's no way to alleviate it. And with processing speed, it might be something that happened hours ago or yesterday or something. So supporting somebody in a crisis with alexithymia can be tricky. And so you can have negative emotions. You may have no emotions at all, which unfortunately then there can be a sudden huge wave of emotion that's difficult to regulate. And an autistic person may still not know what that emotion is and can find it very difficult to manage. So this can be a crisis for the autistic person, especially if they're already highly anxious. And we'll see further in the presentation what alexithymia can do as far as being concerning for suicide. I want to talk about impulsivity, and then I'll show you exactly what I mean about it working together for an autistic person to be very concerning about suicide. So the contributing factors, which impulsivity is a core feature of autism, and some contributing factors include sensory processing, being hypersensitive to certain sounds, textures, touch, lights, which is dysregulating and hard to cope with, leading to impulsive behaviors. Executive functioning, which is cognitive processes responsible for planning and organizing and completing tasks. Autistic people can have challenges with executive functioning that lead to poor decision-making and difficulty regulating their behavior. And that's a safety concern with impulsivity and alexithymia, together with somebody who's already experiencing suicidal ideation and self-harm. So together, somebody can engage in behaviors that could seriously harm themselves or even dying by suicide without even thinking about or knowing what they're doing because of that impulsivity, that lack of being able to explain your emotions, that impulsivity, and then they can just, before they even know it, they could have done some harm to themselves. And that's the safety concern. So we're going to go to unique risk factors. This list is not all of the unique risk factors. It contains some of the most studied and supported. There's also thwarted belonging. A diagnosis of autism itself is a unique risk factor. And we have the co-occurring psychiatric conditions, which I already talked about before, that study in Denmark with anxiety and depression being the most common, and having 90% of those autistic people in the study having a co-occurring psychiatric disorder. Then we have lack of social support. And I like to put it together with unmet support needs in autistic people significantly predict suicidality, even after controlling for a number of demographics and diagnoses. Unmet needs is defined pretty broadly. It could be unmet needs in the home, owning a home, with employment, mental or physical health care, finances, social activities, on and on and on. Just it really, there's the number of unmet needs at the same time with that lack of social support. Masking or camouflaging that I already explained, whereby autistic people attempt to mask or camouflage your autistic traits. It's profoundly lonely and is detrimental to one's mental health. Even though it, like I said before, even though it is helpful socially, nobody knows who you are as a person. It's exhausting. And the reason why many autistic people have to withdraw for self-care after going to school or work or social activity. Having a late diagnosis is a unique risk factor of suicide for autistic people. It can be related to the unmet needs and supportive lack of social support, but there's also a lot of grief experienced by autistic people diagnosed later in life. They mourn what could have been if they'd only known sooner, and they have a sense that something was different about them their whole lives, but didn't know what it was. And when they find out, there's regrets and the sense that if they'd only known, they would have done things differently. Autistic females are at a particularly high rate of suicide. Research study shows that the rate to be 13 times higher than their non-autistic female peers. Many experience being misdiagnosed, invalidated about what they're experiencing, and are experiencing all the other risk factors above it as well. The last one that's supported is autistic burnout, which is an intense physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion with regression of skills that some adults with autism experience. And many autistic people say it results from mainly having the cumulative effect of having to navigate a world that was really just not designed for them, including being invalidated. And also it's the demands of life chronically outweighing an autistic person's ability to cope. So understanding autism and the culture of autistic people, so autistic people do not have to mask their autism, is suicide prevention. Cultural knowledge would be understanding autism and not just the book learning part, but actually asking people who are living with autism what it's like and learning from them. Some examples of autistic culture would be knowing that autistic people have those focused passions, adherence to routine, have a unique way of being, and it's okay, accepting that, differences in communication and being okay with that. So a lot of times in the support groups that I co-facilitate, it's okay if an autistic person doesn't turn on their camera or communicates through the chat. That's all okay. And if it was okay everywhere else, it would just be so much better for autistic people. So in crisis support, though, knowing the strengths of autistic people. So I like to do strength-based support. And these are some of the strengths. And these are some of the strengths that I chose that are really good in supporting autistic people in crisis and in, suicide prevention. So they're very creative people. And on the other end of that, the problem solvers, so they're creative problem solvers. So having them be part of the solution for their own, suicidal ideation or crisis is going to be really supportive to them, really validate them, always presume competence. Just because somebody's in a crisis or has difficulty with social communication, that doesn't mean they're not competent. So presuming that competence is really important. Autistic people tend to be very honest, and it can kind of get us in trouble sometimes, but you'll really find out what's going on with them because they're going to be honest about it. But you have to ask them in a way that they understand. So if you say to somebody, do you want to kill yourself? An autistic person may say no, but they're planning on it. And it might be that day or that next day, and they're planning on it. But what you asked them was if they wanted to, and they don't want to. It's just they don't have any other way of going on. And so they might be planning it. So asking what you want the answer to with an autistic person is very supportive. And remembering that they not only understand the world in a literal way a lot of times, but they hear questions in a literal way as well. They adhere to routine, which is amazing when you're trying to get somebody to use a safety plan. Once it becomes a routine for them, they're most likely going to use it. And in making the safety plan, being detail oriented is a very, it's a strength. To write down everything that might keep them safe, reduce access to means, being rule-based. So I live with suicidal ideation, and when it gets too strong for me, I have a rule where I will sit in my car. I don't go in my home where there's access to means. So until I can get my suicide thoughts down in a more comfortable way that I'm comfortable with, I won't even go in the house. I'll sit in my car, I'll go for a walk. And I go, and that sticks because it's a rule and I'm rule-based. Fairness is very important to autistic people. So talking to them about, are they being fair to themselves? Are they being fair to their loved ones? So there are strengths to use when supporting autistic people in crisis, but there's also challenges as well. So knowing that there's sensory issues to keep in mind that could put somebody in a crisis, executive functioning skills, kind of plays into that impulsivity that can be very concerning if they already have suicidal ideation, alexithymia, they could hurt themselves before they even know it. Social situations are always difficult and challenging. Communication differences, supporting autistic people in a way that they understand. Rigidity and perseveration can be very difficult for an autistic person to get those negative experience or negative thought pattern out of their minds, because perseveration is very, very strong. Cognitive rigidity is strong as well. So I suggest, and it's in one of the resources that we'll talk about, is using their special interest. Getting them talking about that may be enough to help them kind of get out of that perseverative loop, but they may go back in it, and it may be just an ongoing support in that way. Change is very difficult for autistic people and can even put them in a crisis. They have the co-occurring disorders. They have a slower processing speed, so allowing time to process what's happening and formulate words is very supportive. And then that alexithymia, and knowing that they may not know, or they may not be able to describe what they're feeling. So I suggest to hook it to an experience they've already had. So if it's a child, they may explain that they feel the same way they did when they had a birthday and invited some, people and nobody came. Or for an adult, they might feel the same way they did the day they got fired. So any kind of past experience that you can hook how they're feeling now, they may not have the words to it, but they may be able to, talk about a past experience where they felt sort of the same way. So now we're getting to resources. These are the 4 resources that I'm going to share. They're written in collaboration with the Autism and Suicide Prevention Work Group that I founded in 2017. And I always just want to make sure to make this disclaimer to do not make any important life-altering decisions based solely on the information in these following slides. The information is designed to broaden knowledge about autistic people. Your autistic client really knows most about themselves or the family member or friend that you're supporting. And your job is to be very supportive, is to help them communicate their needs to you. So the first toolkit was written for crisis center workers and other helpers in identifying and supporting autistic people in crisis. That's the original purpose. So the crisis toolkit explains how an autistic person might communicate, think differently, for example, very literal, discusses sensory issues, relationship challenges, such as difficulty in making, developing, and keeping friendships. The toolkit also explains misunderstandings, invalidation, and various ways miscommunication can lead to isolation and thwarted belonging. The toolkit also suggests practical ways to support an autistic person in crisis. There's a one-page pullout to use in real time. The toolkit's now being used by various professionals to support autistic people in crisis, and even family and friends are using it. It's also been translated into 2 languages for the use in the countries of Brazil and Portugal. And even the mainstream media in Brazil is supporting it, so that's pretty cool. So some of the things that we talk about in the crisis toolkit is asking This is so important, asking direct, clear questions, using few words as possible and getting straight to the point, even if it feels like you're being blunt and rude. It's kind for the autistic person. And that's who, you're trying to support. So just, using the dictionary meaning of words, getting straight to the point, no flowery words in between, just no hinting. Because for us, there's nothing in between the lines. Allow extra time for processing thoughts and formulating words because of that processing speed. And then to help shift the thoughts, ask about any special interests they might have using that communication style of direct, clear questions, getting straight to the point. We also talk about avoiding metaphors, social nuances, or slang, because even if the autistic person you're supporting and you know them and they use that and understand that, if they're not in a crisis, there's a reduction of skills in a crisis. There's overwhelm, there's anxiety, there's so much going on that it's difficult to have to, go through that, all that kind of energy you have to use those metaphors, slangs, and social nuances, and they may lose that in a crisis. Speaking words of logic instead of emotions, especially if you're supporting somebody with alexithymia. And then explaining positive coping skills and how they're helpful. I had a lot of feedback from autistic adults saying that they thought that they were being dismissed if they were told to go for a walk or listen to music or, have a drink lots of water, things like that. They thought they were being dismissed, but when they realized it was to help regulate their anxiety and help to just regulate anyway, then they were much more willing to use it and felt, much better about being told to do those things. The crisis toolkit also talks about supporting autistic people in crisis, possibly facilitating a safety plan depending on the person that you're supporting. I would always encourage them to write down that plan. A lot of autistic people are very visual, and they may, with a high anxiety, they may forget what was said to them. So writing everything down is very supportive. Helping the person connect with local resources is also supportive. They may never have done it before. The first time that I reached out to a community service for help, I was in my low 50s, and it was very hard to do. I was going to this place where, women can go and get help, and I had to will myself to go through those doors because it was like a big black box to me. I couldn't plan for it. I didn't know what was on the other side of those doors. I got myself in front of the lady I was supposed to. I told my story and she laughed. And I'm not sure to this day why she laughed. I don't know how I told it. I don't know, there's so much I don't know, but I did get up and leave and I didn't get any help. So discussing what's going to happen, writing down things, possibly practicing. What do you say? What do you not say? What questions do you ask? Anything that you can do to help an autistic person get help with a community resource would be supportive. This next resource is considerations of warning signs. The purpose was to show considerations to take when assessing or supporting autistic people with warning signs for the general population. So it contains 10 warning signs that were listed on the American Association of Suicidology's website and explain considerations to take when supporting autistic people. So some of the considerations are aspects of autism, regulating, investigating further is in the toolkit, using communication that you get from the crisis toolkit, that first one, and then really understanding the people that you are supporting. So one of the suicide warning signs is anxiety, agitation, sleep issues, which are all symptoms and difficulties autistic people struggle with regularly. So what we want to find out is make sure we find out is if an autistic person is, if they're suicidal, we don't want them to be deemed as just being autistic. And if they're just being autistic, we don't want them to be, thought to be suicidal. Both ways are going to be have unintentional harm. So we want to find out what's really going on. So how might we know if one of these is actually an aspect of autism or a warning sign of suicide? Well, we use the concise, specific language in the crisis toolkit, and investigate any changes in level of anxiety, agitation, or sleep issues, and really, really try to communicate with the autistic person in a way that they understand. Withdrawal is a warning sign of suicide for the general population. It's also a coping mechanism used for self-care for autistic people. It could also very well be a warning sign of suicide for autistic people. So again, determining any changes in baseline. Is it increasing? Is it increasing and they're regulated, or is it increasing and they're still not regulated? Just finding out what's going on for them, seeing the person before you, using that concise, specific language, very literal, no slang, is going to be supportive. This one is a warning sign of suicide for the general population and is probably the closest, truest warning sign for autistic people if we had them. There are autistic people who have strong emotional connections with possessions, objects, and many are very connected to their pets, some of who are support animals or therapy pets. So this behavior definitely warrants further investigation. Remember the person you're helping. Autistic people may have other reasons for giving away prized possessions. And I'm going to tell this little story. I knew this little boy who had a blue car, and the blue car's name was Norbert. And this little boy and Norbert were never separated. They were always together. When I saw the little boy, I saw Norbert, and it was just, he just always had Norbert everywhere. And then one day he came up to me with emotion in his eyes, cuddling, cradling the little car Norbert in his both hands, and asked me if I could keep Norbert for him because he loved Norbert too much. So that was pretty good insight for around a 10-year-old. And I did keep Norbert for him. I kept checking in every once in a while if he wanted to see him, if he wanted to hold him, if, did he want him back? He didn't. He has him back now, though. But if I had seen that boy without Norbert, without that conversation, or knowing that he had that conversation with somebody else, I would be very concerned. So just, again, investigating what's going on with the autistic person, using language that they understand is supportive. The next resource I'm going to talk about is warning signs of suicide for autistic people. This was an international team of researchers, clinicians, and autistic people who over a year's time looked at all the research and came up with a proposed set of warning signs of suicide for autistic people. And the toolkit has the 10 research-based warning signs. It has scenarios which show what it might look like for autistic people that you're supporting, and has the research. So here are the warning signs of suicide, proposed warning signs of suicide for autistic people. And it's really behavior that is based on an increase or decrease from baseline. And I'm going to go through a couple of them. And these are condensed versions. They're longer in the resource, but I'm going to read this one to you and then show you just some aspects to be concerned about, or what might be concerning and how to support. So Lucia routinely withdraws for self-care. Her family and friends understand her need to do this. And Lucia's family and friends noticed that she was spending more and more time in her room. Lucia goes straight to her room when she gets home, only coming out for meals. Lucia continues to attend her usual activities, although she doesn't want to. She no longer wants to make her clay animals and has not replaced that passion with another. Because some autistic people do replace special passions sometimes with another. But what's concerning here is she's spending more and more time in her room. She's not as regulated, and she does no longer wants to make her clay animals. Research shows us that many autistic people value alone time to recover after intense social events, but it's particularly concerning if increased social withdrawal is coupled with reduced interest in pleasure and a previous intense interest. So this might be warning signs of suicide for depression. Warning signs for depression in autistic people, which could include suicidal thoughts. So one other thing in this scenario that's very, very interesting for autistic people is a lot of times professionals will say, well, is this person that, supporting, are they still going to school? Are they still going to work? Are they still doing their after school activities? Are they still going out on the weekends to social events? And if the answer is yes, the professional might say, well, that's good. That's good. That I'm less worried about them. But for autistic people, continuing to do their usual activities may be because it's too exhausting to change a routine, because we're so routine based. So it doesn't mean the same for an autistic person if they're still doing their usual activities, especially if they don't want to. It could mean that it's just harder to change than to keep doing it. So knowing that would be very supportive. Warning sign number 6. This is a new focus on death-related topics that are not of special interest. Jin calmly stated he wanted to kill himself one day after school. There was no emotion. He was not agitated, but rather matter of fact. He could not articulate why. Jin continued to focus on suicide. He mentioned people in the news who had died, talked about people in the movies dying, discussed the best ways to die. There was no dramatic.
You didn't even finish what was read on the scenario.
Okay, well, I'll let people read it. And I just want to say that at this point, because Jin has said he wants to kill himself, this is an emergency situation for him. So even though there's no emotion, even though he's not visibly agitated, he has no outward display of emotion. He's just very matter of fact. It is still an emergency situation for Jin because he has said he wanted to kill himself. So words have to have more meaning than outward display of emotion for autistic people. Now, I will go through period of, if I'm in crisis, period of where I might cry and look visibly upset. But as I get deeper into crisis, I look perfectly fine and okay. So if you think about going into a room and with, to triage with autistic people, and one is sitting in a chair, kind of crying silently, one is crying harder and kind of visibly pacing, and one is sitting there perfectly calm, perfectly okay, that person may be in the worst crisis than the rest of them. There is one warning sign of suicide where it's no communication to kind of verbalize distress, because sometimes autistic people lose the ability to communicate and they're in a worse distress than they are when they can communicate. So that's this warning sign. The research shows that, like Jin, many autistic people can report suicidal thoughts and or behaviors without necessarily showing the same degree of distress as seen in non-autistic people. Because of this, many autistic people report not being believed when they report suicidal intent. Very, very, very important to know that an autistic person can just calmly say they're going to kill themselves, and that is an emergency situation because everything for them is happening on the inside internally. So main points for this resource is to watch for changes from baseline as far as withdrawal, regulating, anxiety, self-harm, or depression. Autistic people in crisis may not act like non-autistic people in crisis. It can be very, very different. May not be able to verbalize emotions or what they're experiencing. New focus on death-related topics, so that you must discern between special passion and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. A lot of autistic people have suicide as a special passion, of maybe actors or politicians or other, special kind of people or populations, but it's concerning. So, if you're supporting them, watching to see if it becomes personal and all of a sudden they're experiencing personally suicidal thoughts and behaviors. They may research ways to die by suicide, and what may be traumatic for an autistic person could be different from what causes trauma in non-autistic people. So for example, if you're supporting somebody who's autistic and they're in crisis because they lost a friend, they might be told that, well, everybody loses friends every once in a while. But for them, it could be the only friend that they have. And it could be after a history of years and years and years of losing friendships. And it could be enough so that's something that could put them in a crisis, which may not for non-autistic people. The last resource I'm going to talk about today is a Reasons for Living. This is for autistic adults to do either by themselves or with support. And it really is just to remind them why to not die. It's to give hope, to help possibly regulate feelings, even if they don't understand those feelings and can't explain those feelings, to remind them they have a purpose. Now, this is really important, especially for masking and camouflaging, who did not ever develop a sense of self, and they've been masking for years and years because they're late diagnosed. And even those diagnosed earlier in life, they mask as well. Because that can remind them who they are and what they can do. So if you're helping somebody, or if you're doing this by yourself and you love to read, I would put down that you're a reader, or if you love to garden, that you're a gardener. Something that gives that sense of purpose and of who you are. It describes where to keep your list. And the resource goes on to just show different ways to create it. Asking, questions to ask even. It doesn't have to be really lofty things on the list. It could be that someone's waiting to see the next season of their favorite show on Netflix. They're waiting for their next favorite author to write a book. It could be somewhere they want to visit. Just something that means something to them. And then it talks about how living with thoughts of suicide can be very difficult and things to remember. It could be difficult to make this list, and that can be discouraging, but it really did help me. My list is dog-eared right now. It's just a reminder when your mind is so full of anxiety and impending doom and you're in crisis, to have this list to remember and just read it. And it helps to calm those thoughts. It shows when to use the list, some ideas of how to use the list, and the very, very important thing about changing the list. So if somebody has a pet down, or an object that somehow gets lost and is no longer in their life, making sure that list gets updated, because if they're in crisis and they grab that list and they see that thing or person that's not in their life anymore, that could be just terrible. So making sure it's always updated. So in conclusion, we all have a role to play in suicide prevention efforts, but learning directly from autistic people with lived experience of suicidality is going to be really important and very supportive for other autistic people who, have suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Don't be afraid to ask about suicidal thoughts. Research has shown it will not put the idea in somebody's head. And then when you listen to the answer, reacting in the way that will open the conversation up for more conversation is going to be very important. So for an autistic person who has communication difficulties, it might be really hard for them to know who to tell, what to tell, how much to tell. But if somebody opens that conversation for them, that might be very, very supportive, and they might be so relieved. But then, the reaction has to be appropriate as well, so that they'll come and talk to you more and more. Remember that autistic distress may not look like neurotypical distress. This is going to be so, so important. And then to make use of the growing number of autism-specific crisis resources is important, because that's really going to show how to support them, how to communicate with autistic people, what is supportive and what isn't. And then advocate for more autism-specific training for crisis center workers, emergency department clinicians, first responders, and other mental health professionals, and even family and friends. And that is it for me. I'm done. I'm ready for some questions.
And we have some questions. Thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing with us.
You're welcome.
We have related to that last line in your last slide. We have a question very specific to that. And it's, can people who work with assessment and crisis be taught that instead of the usual ask, are you okay? Are you thinking about harming yourself? Rather ask, how many times today did you think about hurting yourself or ending your life? Or how many times this week? Because if someone has thought about it an hour ago or 15 minutes ago, they can articulate that it's not an open-ended question. Does that make sense to you, Lisa?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, and I think they can be taught, like, and it may have to be autistic people advocating for themselves. And but ask a lot of the questions that they ask to determine if somebody's suicidal or has suicidal ideation or is in crisis or needs support. Autistic people don't understand them, or they're not enough. Like that person said, it's good to be known that how many times they thought about it. And if sometimes people will answer so literally that they aren't even able to tell what they want to tell, if that makes sense. I'm thinking about this autistic boy who had a sore throat, and he'd had it for a couple of days, and his mother was bringing him to the doctors. But the moment the doctor asked him if his throat hurt, it didn't, whether he had just had a drink or just had a lozenge, it didn't hurt anymore. So he told the doctor no. And then his mother had to elaborate and say, well, but it's hurt for, yesterday and last night. And then the boy was like, yeah, it did. Oh, really bad. But he answered exactly what the doctor had asked him. And so that is a problem when supporting autistic people for suicidal, ideation and thoughts and attempts.
That same person who posted that question also added, my loved one has been in CMH plan for 7 years, in and out of the hospital for that long. This speaker is the first person I've ever heard of nurses, social workers, group home managers, provider. This is the first person I ever heard validate almost word for word what my loved one lives with and what I see. What resources, like online, can I point a provider whom there's a slight chance they might want to learn? Providers we deal with just do not seem to know any of them.
Yes, all that website, autismcrisissupport.com, all of these resources are on there, available for free downloadable PDFs. Share them with everyone who will listen or read them.
Yeah, and I also put the link for your website in the chat, so people should be able to link to it from there. Our first question has to do with a teenager with autism. I am just learning about autism due to the fact that my youngest child went undiagnosed until she was 14 due to her being very high functioning. Now that I'm learning new strategies to help her, I am finding it very hard to explain to my family why she reacts to things differently and how to deal with her when she's having an episode. Can you give me some ideas on how to help people understand while learning myself?
Yeah, it is very difficult. I work with a lot of autistic adults who are diagnosed later in life, some in their 70s even, who try to tell family members and they just don't believe them because of the masking. I'm sure your daughter is a masker. And so she looks fine, normal. Normal's just a setting on the dryer. I don't like that, but for lack of a better word, she looks normal. And so they expect, there's some expectations there that she is going to react like everybody else that they know. But education about, autism always helps. I wish everybody who was supporting an autistic person could read Uniquely Human by Barry Prezant. That's an amazing book that helps to understand the autistic person and their experience. But I would just try to, explain what autism is, explain about masking, explain that she's trying to regulate and the environment is hard for her. So everything's turned up. Try to explain as if, her having some, music that everyone else thinks okay, could be like she's in this nightclub where the music's so loud you can't even talk to each other. And it just kind of explain what that experience is for her. But yeah, education is just going to be the way to try to do that.
Thank you. Our next question is, how might I start the conversation with my 33-year-old son, who appears to be on the spectrum but's never been diagnosed? He receives treatment for bipolar disorder too, and a prior counselor suggested to me that he might be on the spectrum. At this time, my husband was dismissive of the idea and declined the testing for diagnosis.
Yeah. Well, again, it's all about education and possibly, being able to point out why you think your son might be on the spectrum. There's no services for adults on the spectrum. So really, a lot of times when adults are looking for a diagnosis, it's to try to help themselves explain why they have the experiences they have in their lives. So for example, when I got my diagnosis when I was 48 years old, it was because I got fired from a teaching job. And I was born a teacher. I had just about every parent go into the principal's office and ask to have me back. But he said I just didn't get along with the other people. And I didn't. They were people, I felt like I was in middle school again. I did not get along with those other teachers. So that's why I went and tried to find out why, why is this happening to me? So if your son's not in that place, I'm not sure if he might or might not, but I would just, try to explain to him why you think he is on the autism spectrum, maybe what difficulty he's having, maybe even ask him or tell him how sort of to work around some of the difficulties having, and then suggest, these work for autistic people. Why don't you, try some of this, try regulating, try, there's different coping mechanisms that you can use. There's different ways to get around small talk by having conversation starters in your pocket. Just different things like that. Maybe that might help.
Thank you. We have a lot of people asking, how do you get tested as an adult?
Those waiting lines are years long. Unfortunately, right now. I would say just get on a waiting line to be, a psychologist, have a neuropsych eval done. A lot of people are self-diagnosed, and more self-diagnosed is very, very much accepted in the autism community. So that would allow you to join autism support groups and meet other autistic people. I co-facilitate a couple of support groups of over age 50 with AANE.org from Massachusetts. They have a lot of online support groups, online activities for all ages. And there's a woman that came on and said, I'm suspecting that I'm autistic and I want to talk to more autistic people just to see if it kind of validates who I think I am. And by the end of her first group, she was like, oh my gosh, you guys think just like me. I think just like you. And so she was really validated in the fact that she may be autistic. But as far as getting a formal diagnosis, those waiting lines are very, very long.
I think we've answered everyone's question. Yes. A lot of people are just remarking that one person remarked that she concurs, she lives this, and what you shared struck her so personally. So We do appreciate the fact that you came and shared with us today, Lisa.
No, I'm glad to be here. Sorry that it kind of cut out a few times, but at least I think we got the whole thing in. So
I think we did. And I'm going to, let's see.
should I stop sharing now?
Yes.
Okay.
So lots of comments about appreciating what you shared.
Nice. Well, I'm glad everybody came and learned something, and I know that, now they can share it with people that they know, and we can get the word out there how to support autistic people in crisis.
So I do want to close this session with a few closing comments. I want to thank everyone for joining this session today. Please be sure to check out our virtual Expo Center booth for downloadable materials. Lisa does have a booth, and a lot of the resources she was talking about are available in there. Please keep an eye out for the evaluation, which will be emailed to you at the end of the conference. We appreciate your feedback on this session and the conference as a whole. If you need a certificate, you'll be able to download one after completing the survey. A recording of this session will be available in the conference lobby later this week, and then on the NAMI New Hampshire YouTube channel. Up next at 4 o'clock, we have Tom Dearborn, Eric Skinner, and Rob Cass of the Highs and Lows Tour, a community cycling event for better mental health. We will see you there.